Hi, welcome. My name is Chris. This is the video accompaniment for the online course for applicable tonal theory. Basically, we're going to be learning how to use a school of musical theory called tonal theory to explain how harmonies work in music, and over the entirety of this course, learn how to use that to enhance our musical vocabulary. So, just as a side, just before we start, if you're just starting out learning music, if you don't really know how to read notes on sheet music, or if you don't really know what chords are or musical keys, this course is probably a little bit above what you should be looking at right now. You would do better just to focus on the basics and come back to this later. You can certainly watch it and see, you'll probably learn something as you go, and maybe you'll pick stuff up. I don't want to stop curious minds, but just a heads up that this will be getting into some advanced territories, and especially in this first unit that we're going to be going over today, we're going to be covering a lot of groundwork just to get a firm foundation. So we'll be moving pretty quickly. Even if you do have a firm grasp on the basics, you might have to pause, rewind, reread, rewatch bits a few times to make sure you get everything down. As always, the best way to learn anything is to practice the concepts we go over. But yeah, I just wanted to get that out of the way first. And cool, with that, let's dive in. And if you have the handouts, you'll be seeing them on the screen, but you might also want to have them on hand just so you can take notes as we go. We're going to be starting with page 1 here. So yeah, this course is all about learning the fundamentals of harmony and music theories to expand your musical vocabulary. And we're going to be starting off with kind of our default chords that we'll be using to build chord progressions, and that's pretty much anything that's in key. And just as a recap, we get our key signatures from our major scale. So if we take the notes of the C major scale, those notes, those are all the white notes. So the key of C major has no sharps or flats in its key signature. If we slide that up now and play that same pattern of notes, that same ordering of whole steps and half steps, we need the F sharp and the C sharp. So we see those pop up in the key signature, and when we play just the notes in the key signature, it doesn't really matter what we play. All those notes, more or less, are going to sound good together. So here's playing in the key of D, just playing those notes that I just played. It all, without even really having to think about it, just kind of works. So if we build up our major and minor chords from those notes using just the notes in that scale, we get a pattern of chords that all kind of flow together. They all work together. It's a family of chords that work together, and we call those chords diatonic chords, and that's just a fancy word meaning that they belong to the key. They're made with just the notes in that key signature. So working with C major, since it's kind of our default key and it's pretty straightforward, we have a C major chord, then we have a D minor chord. We wouldn't have a D major chord in this key because D major needs that F sharp, and since F sharp isn't in the scale, we don't use that. So we got a C major again, then a D minor, and then an E minor, and then an F major, a G major, an A minor, and then the last step we get is actually a diminished chord. What we've done, if you're not familiar with diminished chords, we just basically take a minor chord and then we lower that fifth down as well, and that kind of gives us this really dark, very dissonant sounding chord. But every major key is going to have it, and just to recap, every major key, whether it's D major, E major, F major, it doesn't matter what, they're going to have that same pattern of a major chord being built on the first step of the scale, a minor chord on the second, minor on the third, major on the fourth, major on the fifth, minor on the sixth, and then a diminished on the seventh. And that's kind of what we use the Roman numeral system for. That way we don't have to say, oh, it's a C major or an F major. We go, no, we're just talking about the major 1 key, and it doesn't really matter what key we're talking about. It's just that major 1, so we can kind of start to talk about the relationships between these chords without really having to deal with the specific keys. Now, the cool thing with these chords, and you should get really comfortable playing around with them, practicing, just improvising, is that they all just kind of flow into each other. You can make any sort of chord progression out of those 7 chords, and it's going to work together because they're all coming from the same key, so they're all sort of harmonizing. They all belong to the same family, so they flow into each other very nicely. So you can start to make some quick chord progressions. So going on now to page 2 of our handouts, let's enhance this a little bit. When we play just these triad chords, we're talking about 3-part harmony, and that's cool, but we're going to be coming back to this in later units. But what if we add in a 4th voice? For now, we're just going to add in a very specific 4th voice called the 7th, and that is nice. It's easy to work with because it's sort of the same distance here, so we're just kind of playing every other note, and it's called the 7th. If you're not really familiar with the intervals, we just sort of count up. Okay, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and you can always just sort of look at it as the note that's played before your root note of your chord repeat. So for C major, its 7th is a B. For D minor, it's a C. For E, it's a D. So on and so forth. And this is a good time to mention, with intervals, we could have a B, or we could have a B flat. Both of those are considered a 7th. They're kind of different kinds of 7ths. This is called a major 7th. This is called a minor 7th. We're not going to get too much into that right now. Just be aware that, diatonically speaking, sometimes your 7th is going to be a half step away from your root note. Sometimes it's going to be a whole step away. And that's going to change the sound of that a little bit. And that's something else that we'll be coming back to later. But just to have a consistent naming system, when we have a major triad with a major 7th, so the 7th that's just right next to your root note, that's simply enough just called a C major 7, or whatever note you're building it off of. So with D major, this would be a D major 7, here's an E major 7, here's an F major 7, so on and so forth. If we have a minor triad with a major 7, it's kind of a weird, almost mysterious sounding chord. That's called the C minor major 7, and that's actually kind of on the end line on your worksheet here. You can see that. That's, just think about it. Okay, the minor is referring to the triad, and then the major is referring to the 7th. And working our way back from that, if we have a major triad with a 7th that's a whole step away, where we have that lowered 7th, that's just called a dominant 7th. And we'll come back to that in just a couple minutes to explain why specifically it's called a dominant 7th. But the main reason is just, rather than calling it a major minor 7th, it makes it just a little bit more simple for our naming system if we have it called something kind of different. So just get used to calling that a dominant 7. And then if we have a minor triad with the dominant 7, we just call it a minor 7th. And that's where the minor is just referring to the triad. The dominant 7 is sort of implied. Lastly, things that we can do to spice up our chords a little bit, make things a little more interesting right from the get-go, is we can start to invert our chords, and that's just changing the order of them. So here's a C major 7. In first inversion, what happens is now we just kind of take the note that's on the bottom, that C, we slide it up, and now the E's on the bottom. And really, you can voice, when we're talking about inversions, we're really only concerned with what the lowest note of the chord that we're playing is. These other notes up here, we could kind of rearrange them. So I just put that G up there. That would still just be called a C major 7 in first inversion, because we're just worried about which note is in the group, or I'm sorry, is in the bass. So we say, okay, the third of the chord is in the bass, is first inversion. In second inversion, we've taken the fifth of the chord and put it in the bass. So if we take that C major chord, okay, there's the fifth, it's 5 notes up. Now we put that in the bass. And then if we can go one step further with our 4-part chords and put the 7th in the bass. And now we've just got it like that. And you can see on the handouts our kind of Roman numeral naming system. The numbers next to the Roman numeral sort of indicates, okay, what kind of inversion is it? And that just has to do with the distance between the bass and the higher up note. So when it's just in root position, we just call it by the Roman numeral. Here we've got the E in the bass, and then 6 notes up is the C, and 5 notes up is the B, and then 3 up is the G. So we go, okay, it's a C major 7, or a 1, 6, 5, 3. And the 3 is kind of usually just disregarded because it doesn't really distinguish it from other chords, so it's usually called a 1, 6, 5 chord. And that's a specific naming system. You'll sometimes see people more casually, again, if they're not really working with Roman numerals, write it as just a C major 7 / E, C major 7 over E. Whatever really works here. Again, this is you'll see me come back to this a few times throughout this course. Try not to, I don't want you to overcomplicate things with this. This is applicable tonal theory. We're really only learning what we need to learn to do interesting, cool things with it down the line. So don't obsess over this stuff, but I do want you to have the information if you really want to get specific with it. And carrying on now, here's a, we would say this is a 1, 6, 4, 3, or a 1, 6, 4. Now here we've got a 1, 6, 4, 2. So this kind of gets called a 1, 4, 2. So just 1, 7, because we got it the 7, it's 7 notes up. The others are sort of implied. 1, 6, 5. A 1, 4, 3, or 6, 4, 3. A 1, 4, 2, or 6, 4, 2. So you'll see that listed throughout on these pages. Those are what those are. You can come back to here if you really want to look. But you can always just sort of look at the notes making up the chord and go, oh, okay, this is a C major 7, and they've just got the 7th in the bass, the B in the bass. So, cool. Now that that's out of the way, now we can start really diving into tonal theory, talking about what it's about and what we're doing. And what we're doing in tonal theory is we're starting with these diatonic chords, these chords that belong to the key, and we're looking at how they lead into one another, and we're saying, okay, why do some chord progressions, so let's why do some have this certain power where it feels like they're really strongly resolving to one another, is sort of the terminology we use, that it feels like it has nowhere, like the strongest motion it can make from, for example, this one here, and this is what we're going to be starting with, this chord, there it is in root position, really wants, our ear really hears that, and there's a sort of expectation that is going to resolve to our C major chord. And what composers started thinking about is, why is that? Let's come back to the scale for a second. Listen to that last step. I can stop at any other point in the scale. And the ear doesn't really have a preference for where it wants that to continue. It doesn't go, oh, I want this to move up or move down. It really doesn't matter. But when we get to that last step, the ear really wants to hear it resolve up to that C. And so that gets called a leading tone because it's pulling the ear, and that every major scale is going to have that. And that's basically because it's a half step away, and after approaching it using all the previous notes of that pattern of whole steps and half steps that are in a major scale, the ear has that expectation now, and it wants us to resolve that up to the C. So that's kind of important ingredient number one. The other really important motion or sound of music is going to be motions by a fifth. And when we talk about these motions and stuff, we're talking about the bass or the root note of a chord. So our ear will hear that motion of fives, this descending fives motion, as very strong. And that's mainly because in music we have, after just an octave, the most stable consonant harmony we have is that perfect fifth. So when we move by that, it starts becoming this very strong motion that the ear really appreciates. And so if we take a look now at the chord that's built off of that fifth step of the scale, and here it is just in a triad position, we're not going to add in the seventh yet or anything. When we move from this to C major, what we're doing is we have that leading tone that's resolving to C, and it doesn't even really have to be this next C right next to that leading tone. It certainly sounds a little better if it does, but the ear will still hear and appreciate even when that C is located down here. The other thing going on, of course, is that we have that motion. Our root motion is going from G to C. It's moving in that perfect fifth motion. So this 5 chord really resolves strongly to C, and it gives us sort of a sense of C major, or our major 1 chord here, as being our center of gravity. So here it is now. Let's do it in D major. So in D major, our 5 chord is going to be A major. And so those two will pair up really nicely, and they're gonna move together, so that A major chord, that major 5, really wants to resolve to D major. It wants to resolve to that center of gravity that our ear hears as being that D major. And this is as good a time as any to mention that these rules that we're introducing, I'm going to emphasize this again, these are not rules for how your chord progressions must move. It's not that, oh, when you're writing chord progressions, you know, the 5 chord has to resolve to the 1 or anything else that we talk about. We're just establishing the rules of why certain motions are stronger than others. Stronger doesn't mean better, doesn't mean more correct. Just means that there's something going on that we can look at. And in later units, we're going to take the knowledge that we gain from this, apply that knowledge, and learn how to do more, to bring in more interesting harmonies, chords that we wouldn't normally think of pairing with these other chords. Basically chords that are outside of this key. Because right now, if you try and do that, it might sound a little bit random. You might struggle a little bit to find the chords that work. And at the same time, though, if you just stick to the chords, the diatonic chords, you'll feel a little limited after a while. So we're learning this here so that you can appreciate how these harmonies work, why certain harmonies are working and feeling more strong or stronger than other chord progressions. But just keep that in mind. It's not rules of how you must move in your chord progressions, but we're just exploring why these chord progressions work, and then later we'll be doing things with that. So, with that said, tonal theory, what it then starts to do is it splits all of our diatonic chords into kind of 3 categories. We have our tonic chord, which is just our 1 chord, and tonic is just sort of the nickname that chord is given. And we'll be giving nicknames to all the chords, but again, not something you really have to memorize. If you just kind of learn the numbers and how they relate, that's just as well. So here's our tonic chord. And then we have our dominant chord, that 5 chord. And that's actually, coming back now to the 7ths, that's where we get that name dominant 7 from, because that's the kind of 7th that's formed naturally off of the dominant chord. So, you know, a bit of musical history knowledge for you. Now, most of the other chords get put into a category just called predominance. And we'll explore that in a moment, but you can imagine what that means. It just means that these are going to be the chords that we're preceding our dominant with. Our 2, our 4, our 6, and our 3. And then we do have that 7th. That actually gets thrown in with our dominant chord. So, why is that happening? Basically, if we take a dominant chord and then we make it a seventh, so there's adding in that F to G major, well, there's our diminished seventh right there. And so this is kind of a cool thing to realize right here, is that listen to what happens if I make a chord progression here where I'm going to play a tonic, then I'm going to play a couple pre-dominant chords just to give us something. And then instead of moving to the dominant to move to the one, I'm going to move to that diminished seventh. So here's a 1, to a 4, to a 2, now to the diminished seventh, inverted. And you hear that it still has that same resolution. We've got that leading tone, and our ear kind of fills in that G that's getting left out from the dominant chord. So that's something cool to realize, is that your ear is going to be doing all sorts of cool, fun things that we're not fully aware of. When we invert chords, it still hears the motion between the roots. It doesn't really, it changes things a little bit, but your ear still makes it out. And even when we have certain notes missing, like that G, it doesn't fully ruin things. Your ear will still fill that information in. So that's kind of cool. So we can use that diminished seven as a substitute. So we put that in the same category. So let's keep moving here. So right now we've got we're kind of making a flow chart, and we're going to fill this in a second once we get a few more chords going. But what we've got is we've got our tonic, we've got our dominant, and we've got another chord, the diminished seven, that we actually will sometimes use as a substitution for that dominant. So we've got sort of two categories in our flow chart right now, our tonic and then our dominance category. So now let's start looking at those predominants. What's going to happen here is we're just going to keep moving back by a fifth. So we moved back by a fifth to find the dominant, to go, okay, what's going to best precede our tonic? Well, it was the dominant. What's now going to best precede our dominant? And we find the second step of the scale. So it's going to be that minor 2 chord that's often called our supertonic, and that nickname just comes because it's a step above the tonic. Again, nothing that mind-blowing. You can take the nicknames or leave them. It's up to you. But let's look at the function here. So when we proceed now our dominant with that, then we can start adding in the seventh. And now we can start doing some cool inversions. So here's that supertonic to the dominant, to the tonic. And then watch what happens now if I keep that first inversion of our supertonic, but then I move to an inverted form of the dominant. So what's happening here is we're changing what's called the voice leading. And that's something else to be aware of, is that the way the voices in these chords move, this is kind of a smoother motion. Our ear still hears that that perfect fifth motion between the roots, even in this inverted form. But now it's all smoothed out, which sounds a lot different than. So that's something to keep in mind. That's going to be ways that we can really make these chords a little more interesting. And kind of the same way that we had that diminished seven in the same category as our dominant, look what happens if we take our supertonic, add in the seventh, take out the root. Well, okay, there's your 4 chord. So the 4 are sometimes used to precede the dominant, but it's also just used as a substitution for that. So now we can start changing our structure of our chords, inverting things, making them a little more interesting. So you can hear that sort of works as a substitution. Here it is if we move actually to our supertonic, so 4 to 2, dominant 7 over F to C. So cool. Let's keep going. If we take our supertonic now and we move back by a fifth, we end up with this chord here, sometimes called our submediant chord. Reason for that is our third chord is sometimes called the mediant, kind of because it's between, it's in the middle of our tonic and dominant. So this one that's 3 down, called the submediant. There you go. But anyhow, so that's our minor 6 chord. You can hear that that flows very nicely into our supertonic. Here's if we move into our 4 chord with that. All sounds real nice. And if we move a fifth back from that, we get our mediant chord. Usually in classical music, you don't really hear this too much. Again, though, we're not really worried about classical music here. We're just learning this so that we can enhance our own musical vocabulary. But another bit of musical history. Usually, if they were going to harmonize a chord over that 3rd step of the scale, they would use an inverted form of the major. Certainly feel free here. Certainly flows nicely into our submediant. So median to submedian. And actually, let's make it a little more interesting. Let's add in the 7th to our median chord. So we've got our submediant. So median to submedian to our major 4 to our supertonic to our dominant in an inverted position to our C major. So there you go. We've kind of got our flow chart now. So let's look at a couple quick examples, and these are the same examples on the worksheet here. So if we're in the key of E flat, we've got 3 flats. So our 1 chord now is E flat, our 2 is F minor, our 3 is G minor, so on and so forth. So we'll make a progression here. We'll take our submediant chord in an inverted form. We'll move to our 4/7 to our supertonic to our dominant to our tonic. So all together. Just making kind of a little bit of a song out of that now. Getting a little creative with it. You can see right away you can start making some interesting chord progressions and then seeing where that takes you songwriting wise. But let's move to a different key. Again, bottom example here, we're in D major, 2 sharps, just kind of doubling that up with our left hand. So we're moving from a median in a inverted form with the added 7th to the submedian to the supertonic inverted to the dominant inverted to the tonic. There's that. Now, there are some further exceptions in this flow chart. First, if we move now, instead of a 5th up to our dominant, we can also move a 5th down if you think about it. The 4 kind of has this other relationship to our tonic because it's also a fifth away, just in the opposite direction. So we move fifth down here. So that ends up being another possibility that you can substitute for a dominant chord. It's not usually considered a dominant, but it also works. And some terminology here. Normally when we move from the dominant to the tonic, if we move from with our en route position, that's called an authentic cadence. Just moving, as a general terminology, moving from dominant to tonic is kind of referred to as a cadence. When we do root position, it's called an authentic. Anything else when we do an inversion, sometimes called an inauthentic cadence. The only reason I introduce this is because now we have a terminology for when we move to the 4 chord. That's called a plagal cadence. So you can hear that here. It's got not quite as strong of a motion, but it still feels a little bit like a resolution. And that's what you can think of a cadence as. It's almost like a period at the end of a sentence. We're just wrapping things up. We've finished a musical thought. We can also move to the submediant, that minor 6, from our dominant chord. That's sometimes called the deceptive cadence. The reason that works is that 6 actually has a special relationship to our tonic. That's what we're going to be exploring in our second unit. That's all about minor keys and how those work. For now, though, just catalog it as, okay, I can also move to the minor 6. Musical idea out of that. So now your flow chart looks a little bit more filled out. Makes it a little bit more interesting. And yeah, so that's pretty much things. Again, I want you to realize that we're going to be using this flow chart. The reason we went through it is that later units we're going to use this to navigate into other keys. It's kind of knowing these rules is going to let us do some cool things. But it's not the end-all, be-all. And just kind of a real quick example of how you can kind of abandon tonal theory a little bit and still get interesting results. We were talking about earlier, we had these 7th chords. You can always try swapping one of those 7ths out for a non-diatonic 7th. So for example, in C major, what if I went to an F major minor 7. Jazzier feel to it, and it doesn't sound wrong at all. You can, at the end of the day, creativity is always what you're going to be looking for in music, but now you can start to think about these chord progressions, why they work. If we take a look at that one, look at the way that minor 7 actually slides down nicely into that D for our dominant chord in an inverted form. So be aware of that, and you can mess around with that and see where things like that go. So that's sort of the last little tip we're going to add in here for things that you can do with these chord progressions. But now you have kind of a tonal theory flow chart. That's something you might come across sometimes. And in our later units, we're going to see what we can do with that. Now you kind of understand why those chords work the way they work. That 5 motion is really strong. That leading tone is really strong. So go ahead, experiment, see what you come up with, and we'll see you in the next unit.